Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hi everyone, it's March 1st, 2019. You're listening to the Storyteller's Thread, and I'm your host, Sean Connors. I have to tell you, I'm especially excited about this month's program. Not only is it the 6th episode of the Storyteller's Thread, meaning that the show has been on the air for half a year now, but this month I'm talking with P. Craig Russell, an artist and illustrator who's worked on comic books and graphic novels for mainstream publishers like Marvel and DC, and whose independent projects include adaptations of everything from Oscar Wilde's fairy tales to Neil Gaiman's short stories and novels. Last month, in February, Craig published his most recent graphic novel, an absolutely gorgeous adaptation of Lois Lowry's The Giver. As you'll soon hear, I talked with Craig about how he approaches adapting literary text in a visual medium, as well as some of the creative challenges that adapting Lowry's novel posed for him. If you're at all interested in comics, I think you're going to enjoy our conversation. And if you haven't seen it yet, the next time you're in a bookstore, do check out Craig's adaptation of The Giver. I think you'll be really impressed with it. If you enjoy the Storyteller's Thread, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a second to rate it over on iTunes or Google Play Music, whichever you use. With that said, I want to dive straight into this month's episode. I told you I'm excited to share it with you. Thanks as always for listening to this podcast, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with P. Craig Russell. Several years ago, at a comic art festival in Columbus, Ohio, I had the opportunity to attend a session in which artist and illustrator P. Craig Russell talked about his experiences adapting Richard Wagner's classic opera, The Ring of the Nibelung, as a 2-volume graphic novel of the same title. It was the first time I'd encountered Russell's work, and I was immediately enchanted by his rich illustration style. Equally memorable, though, was listening to Russell talk about the challenges he faced adapting a musical score for a visual medium. From that moment on, I've remained a loyal reader of Russell's work. A native Ohioan, Russell was born in the town of Wellsville and later attended the University of Cincinnati, where he studied painting and illustration. It was during college that he caught a break when comic artist Dan Adkins invited him to join his studio. Not long after, in the 1970s, Russell established a name for himself at Marvel for his work on comic books in the fantasy genre, such as Killraven and Doctor Strange. In the years that followed, Russell went on to work on some of the most well-known franchises in comics, including, to name a few, Batman, Star Wars, Daredevil, The Sandman, Hellboy, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Russell is perhaps best known, though, for his beautifully rendered adaptations, which, along with The Ring of the Nibelung, include Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, Mozart's The Magic Flute, and Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. In recent years, Russell has collaborated with award-winning author Neil Gaiman to adapt several of his novels and short stories, including The Dream Hunters, set in the universe of one of Gaiman's most well-known characters, the Sandman, and American Gods, published by Dark Horse Comics. Russell has adapted 2 of Gaiman's most beloved children's books as well, Coraline, published in 2008, and The Graveyard Book, a 2-volume graphic novel published in 2014. In February, Russell published his most recent graphic novel, an adaptation of Lois Lowry's Newbery award-winning dystopian novel, The Giver. Entertainment Weekly has called Russell's adaptation stunning, and Kirkus Reviews described it as artistically brilliant. The winner of multiple Eisner and Harvey Awards, Russell resides in Kent, Ohio, where he continues to make comics and graphic novels. In February, just weeks after the release of The Giver, I talked with Russell about his storied career in comics, his passion for adaptation, and his creative process. You grew up in Wellsville, Ohio, which is a point of reference for people who are listening to this podcast, is located approximately 2 hours south of Cleveland and an hour west of Pittsburgh. How would you describe Wellsville as you experienced it growing up in the 1950s and 60s? Was it a large community? What did people tend to do for a living?
Oh, well, no, it was not a large community. When I was growing up, I think the population was around 4,400. It peaked at 10,000 back in the early part of the 20th century when the railroads were coming through, and by the 60s, 50s and 60s, the potteries and steel mills were still running. So it was a fairly prosperous middle-class blue-collar community, very small. The town is about 5 blocks wide and 2 miles long, right on the Ohio River, right across from the tip of the panhandle of West Virginia. Geographically, it was really interesting because, you had the river, the flat of the town, and then the hills. So we spent a lot of time playing in the hills when we were kids and camping out. And, back in the era of free-range kids, you left in the summer after breakfast or lunch, and you were gone for the afternoon. You just got back in time for dinner. Woe betide you if you missed that dinner hour. You were expected to be there. But otherwise, you were... once you were old enough to ride a bike, you were on your own. And it was still, the middle class was wiped out now because the steel mills and the potteries closed, and it's a much more depressed area than it was when I was growing up. It was still a time when my dad had the men's clothing store. My uncle had the perpetual savings and loan. We had a dairy. There was one woman's clothing store, one man's clothing store, 5 and 10, a hardware, but everything was there that you needed, even a few restaurants and one movie house. But that's all pretty much gone. So it was a great time. It was my class, we graduated high school in '69. We kind of say we got the last of the really good Wellsville.
Growing up, were creativity and art things that were valued and encouraged in your home? Were your parents creative people?
Yes and no. It was encouraged. Neither of them were in the arts, although there were other family members. My mother had an aunt who was an opera singer. My father had an uncle who was a concert pianist, went to the New England Conservatory of Music, and so music was around. And I was never discouraged. I had the sort of twin interests of music and art. I took piano lessons, and there were 3 piano teachers in town that were, full-time busy in a town that small. And the church choirs kind of introduced you to different kinds of music. We had some art classes in school, so it was encouraging.
And I've read that you said that you were introduced to opera very young.
Well, it was still, in a way, part of the popular culture. On Ed Sullivan every Sunday night, after the Dancing Bear and the Juggler, there'd be an opera singer. Or there on the Tonight Show, they would. It wasn't unusual for someone to come in and from, Metropolitan Opera or wherever and sing an aria. And then, of course, most everyone went to church. The church choir was based in sort of 19th century music and those kinds of voices. So it was just there. And if you had an interest in it, you could pursue it. Like the Wellsville Public Library had a whole section of classical music, vinyl records that were there. And my friends and I, Patrick Mason and Eric Bush, and I just raided that place and took armfuls of records home.
You mentioned that in addition to music, you also enjoyed art when you were younger. Do you recall when you first began to realize that you had a distinct talent for drawing?
Well, I don't know when I would say that I recognized something like that. I do know when I first became interested. I mean, some of the first experiences that in reflection you realize affected you more than maybe somebody else who wasn't going to pursue a career in art.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how old I was. I think the first Disney animated feature I saw was Cinderella at the drive-in, and I remember scenes from that. And then just a couple years later, a re-release of Snow White and Seven Dwarfs. And there's a scene, which I'm sure everyone has seen, is when the queen is going down into the dungeon to mix her magic potions. She's going down this stairway into the dungeon. It's circular stone stairway. And as she comes around, her cloak, and everything is dark, she's in purple and black. Her cloak flies up and it's scarlet underneath, and then it goes back down. I remember just like being nailed to my seat when I saw that flash of red. It was just stunning. And then just a couple years after that, in 1959, 60, when Sleepy Beauty came out with that Ivan Earl background paintings and color design, and with the square trees and all that, that was another moment. So any of that, my reaction to animation, the animated films, of course, was like any other kid, just entertaining and enjoying the story, but being very interested in the pictures from an early age. And I was drawing from an early age, but everyone was, in class, in kindergarten. There was a time of the day or maybe of the week which you were supposed to sit down and draw a picture, and everyone was doing it. So it was only, I think, in third grade, in class, the teacher had one student, Vicky Cataldo, sit up on a desk in the front of the class, and we all drew her picture. And I remember people kind of crowding around mine and looking at it, and for the first time realizing that I could sort of do something, and I liked the attention.
Do you have a sense of when you first began to entertain the idea that you might become an artist, that might be something you'd want to do for a living?
I think probably by high school. Sort of a seminal event of my life was my junior year in high school. I still remember I was in choir. It was the end of the period after choir, and one of the girls came up to me and asked if I would be the chairman of the decorating committee for the prom and post-prom, the junior prom. And I said, yes, sure, and ended up making committees. I had like 15 people that would come to my house once a week, and then as we got closer to it, almost every night. It was Strawberry Fields was the theme. So it was this sort of psychedelia thing in 1968 with the Beatles and Yellow Submarine and all that. We did 3 paintings that were 9 by 12 feet, these giant psychedelic paintings that I would design and then have, kids who, some had artistic talent and others didn't, but just fill in, with tempera paint, fill in this area. And we had them up on the walls in my house, upstairs. And God bless my parents, they gave us the run of the second floor because it was actually sort of a duplex. So I had a whole house to myself up there, the 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a dining room, and then the whole attic. So I had all these kids up there doing these paintings and posters, and I think a couple thousand tiny little red feet that we cut out of red construction paper that went all over, the gymnasium, the walls and such. I mean, the walls were just covered. And then these flowers that we made and painted and cut out. So, flower power and all of that. It was a real experience. I loved having all these people around me. And ironically, I think that's probably why I chose art over music, because I was also still playing the piano every day and studying. Well, I love the communal aspect of it.
Oh.
The irony is, of course, now I sit in a room by myself for hours on end. Of making art, but I think it was so much fun. And then I of course did the sets for all the school plays and the illustrations for the newspaper and the yearbook and all the other dances. I do, a 9 by 12 foot painting backdrop where you would have your picture, you and your date in front of. So I was enormously busy and learning how to just organize things for these giant projects. I think that's what steered me to choose to go to art school at the University of Cincinnati is what we chose. And yeah, that's what put me on the path of just choosing art. And of course, when you go to art school, you have no idea how, where that's going to lead to. but that's what got me choosing art.
I was actually going to ask you, when you make that decision to go to art school and you earned your Bachelor of Fine Arts in painting and illustrating, I believe.
Yeah.
Were there ever moments when you experienced feelings of self-doubt or when you questioned the feasibility of earning a living as an artist?
No, because I actually started working in comics at Marvel Comics before I finished college.
Oh, okay.
Because I met Dan Adkins my sophomore year, and he lived like just a few miles from Wellsville outside East Liverpool, Ohio. And he'd moved back into that area from New York City, but he was from that area, from West Virginia, and he'd moved back. And I met him, and he told me if I would work with him for a few months, he could get me into Marvel Comics. I didn't even jump at it then, but I waited until my junior year, and the spring semester of junior year, I took a leave of absence from school, worked with Dan, and got my foot in at Marvel. So by the time I finished college, I knew what my profession was going to be. If I hadn't met him, I have no idea what would have happened, because I'm kind of a shy person and not the kind of person that puts themselves really forward. The idea of going to New York City would have been unfathomable to me. I wouldn't have known how to begin to negotiate anything. So I had a real stroke of good luck, of great fortune in meeting Dan.
And he's, of course, a highly regarded figure in the world of comics, and he has a long history behind him. What was it like to work in his studio?
Well, Dan was a character, and everyone that's worked with him will attest to that. Val Merrick came out of his studio, and Paul Galassi. We all three worked with him for months in his studio. And Jerry Bingham, some years later, I think when Dan was living in Reading, Pennsylvania, over there with his studio, a couple blocks from Steranko, and Bingham showed up. And I don't know if he worked with Dan or not, but that's another character in his story. But Dan was kind of a fabulist. He would just tell stories that sounded good, but then you would find out later were just, made up or borrowed from something else. So it was always hard to tell. And he always had stories to tell about Wally Wood, because he was Wally Wood's assistant and then partner for some time in the mid-'60s, until Dan left to just work on his own at Creepy and Airy and Marvel Comics. And Wally Wood was a character, and so he always had these stories to tell about Wally and the other guys working in the studio, Ralph Reese and some other folks. Hardly knew where to draw the line as to believe him in things. He loved Elvis Presley, had all of Elvis's records, and that's what we would listen to. I would work in his studio from 8 or 9 o'clock at night till 3 or 4 in the morning, and then go home. And so he was a night owl, like I've turned out to be. So that was good. His wife was sleeping in the other room, and his little boy, and we didn't bother them. We just had this tiny little studio. And at one point, then Val was working in there, and this other guy, Mark Kersey from, I think, Indiana, came for a short while and then went back home. So there would be 4 of us in this little room. And Dan's idea was to start this studio in Ohio, where he would do layouts and inks and get this sort of stable of artists that would then, pencil. And we would provide content for Marvel Comics. And this is when they were doing the short story horror books, so it was a perfect fit. It sort of fizzled out after a while. I wanted to go back to school, and just about the time I left, after 6 months in that studio, Paul Galassi showed up and was working with Dan. So he inked our first stories. The very first story I did, Dan inked, and a couple others. So he made me look a lot better than I was at the time. It was a great way to start, because he was so conscientious an inker, very crisp and clean. I would see artwork come into the studio, that he was inking, Barry Windsor Smith and Gene Colan, Gil Kane, and as soon as one of those stories would come in, I would drive out and just pour over the pages to hold originals. I'd never seen them before. That's the first time I ever saw original artwork. So it was a whole different experience to see it at, the original size and not shot down with color. So that was a great learning experience.
What do you recall having learned from Dan that in retrospect made you a better storyteller?
Well, I have to say, he didn't, how do I say this? it wasn't exactly a teaching experience. I mean, the first couple stories he would do the breakdowns and layouts for. But I think of one thing I arrived with a sense of storytelling and just knew how to do it, so that as soon as I was on my own, I was perfectly comfortable. Penciling anatomy and perspective and things like that was a whole other thing that that I had to learn by the seat of my pants. But in the very first story he gave me, a 6-page little horror story, I remember having the chutzpah to change the layouts on the last page. He had 3 panels of this transformation of a guy into a werewolf, and I changed it into 6 panels, sort of a la Kriegstein. And it was kind of nervy, but it didn't occur to me that he might not like that, but he didn't have a problem with it, so that was okay. And in pretty short order, I was on my own. What he did, I think the most important thing I got from him was that I would bring something in that I'd penciled, and he would say, not good enough. This isn't working. You got to redraw this, and sometimes he would do a sketch. I had never had that kind of training, even in the university, because that was the era of you can't teach art. Art cannot be taught. So there was none of this, the thigh bone is connected to the hip bone. No training in anatomy, no sort of declarative thing of this is bad or this doesn't work. You need to do this again. So that's the first kind of real world criticism I had to deal with. And of course it pinched sometimes, I'd only ever been told how wonderful I was, from 3rd grade on. And here's this guy saying, no, redo this. So I started learning and developing the ability to look at my own work and say, not good enough, do it again, or erase this and you can make this better. So that was good. And his, the clarity of his penciling was good. And so I learned from that. And one thing he told me was that you had to ink with a brush. So that's the one thing he did that held me back. I thought you had to use a brush, and I could never master a brush. I still haven't to this day to ink with a brush, except to fill in blacks. So it wasn't until I was working at Marvel on Killraven, and I had done one panel that I inked because it was a special effects panel, and I used a pen. And it was Don McGregor said, why aren't you ink? You should ink the whole thing. And I was like, I can't ink. I don't know how to use a brush. It was like, well, use a pen. Okay. And that's when I started inking my own work. So Dan had kind of convinced me that I couldn't ink because he had this brush thing. And so once I got over that, it was fine.
So you get a break really into the industry through your relationship with Dan, and then you've spent the entirety of your career making comics. So I'm curious, what specifically appeals to you about comics as a medium for telling stories?
Well, because it's such a great medium for telling stories. But sort of ask the question is to answer it. It's a wonderful way to tell a story. I think one of the most appealing things about it is, despite its relationship to other forms, pure drawing and or cinema, cinema, the juxtaposition of one image next to another that forms a thread, a ribbon of images that add up to something else. That cinema within the panel is the drawing. You can learn as much from studying the drawings or etchings of Rembrandt or Albrecht Dürer as you can from the films of Stanley Kubrick or Orson Welles. So you have those two poles, and the comic sequential art is somewhere in the middle. But the thing it has that neither of those has is the ability to change the size of the image, and the relationship of size of image to other panels is a part of telling the story. I mean, the obvious thing is the big explosion. You don't do it in a tiny little panel, although you could for some storytelling reason. And as soon as you say something like you can't do that, someone's going to come along and say, I can do that. I know how to make that work. So I learned through Eisner about the effect of making a panel suddenly very small in black and white without borders, where everything else had been in color and full borders. He did that. There's a story he did about Plaster of Paris that ends with a death. And I saw that panel, when I was like 16 years old, and was bowled over by that. By changing the size of the picture, it had an emotional effect. So I like that thing about this form. The storytelling was always the most interesting thing about this. And one thing I had that I just had, everything else has been a slow acquiring of abilities, studying anatomy and perspective and pattern and texture and all of that. I had to slowly, laboriously pick up. But the storytelling, maybe because I just grew up reading comics, you just absorb the ability to tell a story with pictures. But that was the easiest and most natural thing to me.
So you did read comics as a younger person?
Oh, yeah. From as early as I can remember, there were Harvey comics and Walt Disney comics, the Dell comics and Harvey's. And even then, I was starting to recognize styles like the Casper, the Friendly Ghost artist. Whoever the artist was that did most of the main Casper stories had a really beautiful drawing style. The way he did trees and the witch's sort of cottage, or the ghostly trio's cottage in the woods, the haunted houses. There was just something about those drawings that made them really enjoyable and kind of spooky in a childish way. That I liked, and Karl Barks, I could recognize already that things were going on. And then I just grew up with the comics I got into later elementary school and junior high, and I was reading the Archies. And even though they didn't give credits, I could tell the difference between Sam Schwartz, who did Jughead, and Harry Lucy that did Archie, and Dan DiCarlo that did Betty and Veronica. And I was always sort of intrigued by those different styles, even though it was all the same characters. And, even when they had sort of like you could say a template on this is how you draw Archie, this is how you draw Jughead, that's pretty much set in stone. This is how you do it. Even the artist styles would still transcend that template. And that was always interesting to me, that you could recognize the same character.
So when you're reading these comics, you were studying them at the same time that you're reading them.
Well, not in a conscious way. I was just fascinated, and I would just look at it and pore over it. I'd hesitate to call it studying, except in an unconscious way. Yes, absorbing this and simply being aware of it, and just enjoying it. I mean, it was like eating candy. I mean, it was just purely enjoyable experience.
Well, I think it's interesting that you talked about your attentiveness to different artists' style. You have a drawing style that is immediately recognizable to people who are familiar with your work. And as someone who's not an artist, I wonder, how did you come to find your particular style? Is that something that was a result of your training at the University of Cincinnati, or is that more process-driven?
It definitely was not a part of my training at the University of Cincinnati. Anything I did in an illustrative vein was at odds with what they were teaching. In retrospect, I should have, if I had known better, would have found a school that really focused on craft. And like I say, the basics of anatomy. But that was so out of style in the fine art world, and that's what the faculty was really more concerned with. So they did not influence a drawing style. I see myself as sort of an amalgam of influences. A lot of us are, especially the more illustrative artists. Barry Windsor Smith, Bernie Wrightson, Michael Kaluta, Charles Vess. You can go back to the late 19th and early 20th century of illustrators and such, and find a lot of us. I mean, a lot of that goes into. I mean, Ivan Earle, that I mentioned earlier, has influenced the way I do landscapes. It all goes into the hopper, and hopefully, I mean, if you have any originality at all, you'll absorb it, and what comes out is you. I mean, Bernie Wrightson was definitely Bernie Wrightson, but once you started looking close, you could see Jack Davis and Franklin Booth and Ghastly Graham Ingalls and Frank Frazetta, and I think there's a lot of that with the more illustrative artists. Certainly I am. I have Ivan Earle, Kai Nielsen, who did East of the Sun, West of the Moon, the Danish illustrator. That book was like 1914, but he also worked at Disney in the 30s and designed the whole Night on Bald Mountain sequence and some other things. He was a hero of mine and had a big influence on my work. I had a friend, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s or something. It was a college student then, and he was in the studio, and I was talking about various things. I said, "Oh, Kai Nielsen, you got to see this guy's work." And I pulled the book out, and he looked at it, And he looked almost crestfallen. He said, I thought you've invented all this stuff. No. I'm paying homage to Guy Nielsen.
You mentioned that you have pretty extensive experience working in mainstream comics, having worked for Marvel and later for DC. Mm-hmm. And you've worked on titles from Batman to Doctor Strange to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But you're arguably best known for your independent projects, almost all of which involve your adapting other people's work, from classic operas to Oscar Wilde fairy tales to the work of contemporary writers like Neil Gaiman. What is it about adaptation that appeals to you?
Well, for one thing, I was always simply looking for a good story to tell that was outside, the mainstream superhero stuff. I had the good fortune, like in working on Killraven, in that even though he was sort of superheroic, the costumes and all of that, it was outside the Marvel mainstream. It wasn't set in New York City with cars and buses and contemporary life, which I don't find all that interesting to draw. So I was always looking for stories that had a fantasy element. That's why Doctor Strange was good for me. And that could take me into these other worlds where architecture and costume could range, from 1,000 years of art history. So I just gravitated to stories that I'd read and that I'd liked. And since I was a big opera fan, and a lot of opera is so analogous to comic books, especially The Ring of the Nibelung and all of those kinds of stories, I decided to just do some operas. But mostly it was because of the literary work of the piece. There's some beautiful operas that would be ridiculous because they're not very good stories. It's just have beautiful music. So I was just looking for a literary source, and it gave me something to work with. I'm not a writer myself. I've written some stories, and as far as original, plots and characters and all of that. But again, as a storyteller, I have the ability to take someone else's prose and wrestle it into a visual form, in the same way that filmmakers are always taking novels and Broadway musicals or stage plays, and the screenwriter fashions it into a screenplay, and then the director handles it. That's pretty much exactly what I do. I've been offered a few original scripts, like Sandman 50. I've said this before. If I was given that kind of a script every day, I'd never do another adaptation. But I love the puzzle part of taking this prose and finding those things that are just, you would think, impossible to visualize, because there's no action, there's no dialogue. It's just sort of talking about a thing. And it's important to the story to talk about that, but then you say, well, what do I show while this is going on? How do I make this a visual experience? And that's a lot of fun. So basically that's why I do it.
I would have to imagine that some texts lend themselves to being adapted more readily than others.
Yes.
So when you're looking for source text that you want to adapt, what kinds of things do you tend to look for? What do you have to see in a story that signifies to you that, yes, this is going to work as a graphic novel?
Well, I think the first time that occurred to me, I was living in New York City, so this is between 74 and 77. I was in a bookstore, and I happened across the Collected Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde. I was leafing through it. I bought it and read The Young King. There were 9 of these fairy tales, and I thought, I want to do this someday, because it's just a wonderful story and very visual. A lot of fun things to draw. I guess that would be one of the attractions, would be it's a good story and there are fun things to draw. But that's not always the only thing. We can talk about the Giver later, but there's virtually nothing fun to draw in The Giver. So the challenge is a whole other thing of, making it visually interesting. Sometimes it's the things that resist visualizations that are the most interesting to do, just because of the challenge of making this visual, of finding something. It's the hardest thing to do, but when you solve that problem, it's the most rewarding thing. It makes you feel like you can say that there is nothing that cannot be adapted to this form.
In an interview that you give at the end of your most recent adaptation, which is Lois Lowry's The Giver, and we're going to talk about that shortly. You state that while you strive to remain faithful to the themes and the ideas of the source material that you adapt, you also recognize that any adaptation has to succeed by the dictates of its new form. Can you say more about that understanding and how it shapes your work?
Well, yeah, sure. I think one way you can identify with it right away is if you've read enough reviews of film adaptations of stage plays. A constant criticism, if it's warranted, is that the movie remains stage-bound. It feels like a filmed play. And it's difficult because, a play takes place just in a single set. It might change between scenes or acts, but it's all in this one space. And to make that feel cinematic is a challenge. Sometimes they try to open it up, take it outdoors if they haven't any excuse to go outdoors, like Mike Nichols' adaptation of Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Of course, on stage, takes place in a single room and sort of outside in the yard. They get in the car and drive to a bar and have a big knockdown, drag-out scene there. And then there's a little bit of driving back and forth or walking across campus. They were just looking for an excuse to get out of the room. But I think in something like Elia Kazan's adaptation of Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, just through the fluid use of camera work and such, that doesn't feel like it's stage-bound at all. It's a cinematic experience. There have to be interesting visuals. You can't be just telling people something. You have to show it. And like what I was referring to earlier, the challenge of finding the visual. I think Alfred Hitchcock is a great instructor in that way. How visual his storytelling can be in just a conversation. Now on stage, if two people are talking, you're just watching them on stage talking. In the book, you're just reading their dialogue. If you take a scene like Hitchcock's from Vertigo, when Jimmy Stewart, early on as the detective, is being interviewed by his old friend in the old friend's very fancy office. It's a long conversation scene, but how they move from a sort of an elevated area in the back to if the camera's looking down at a character or up at a character, what their power relationships are visually. He's able to illuminate this just pure conversation, and visually he's commenting on it at the same time. So your pictures are commenting on the dialogue. It's what I call sometimes related to this parallel narrative, where you have what the author is writing, but the pictures. If you look at my adaptation of Neil Gaiman's Murder Mysteries, in the introductory pages, when the narrator is talking about who he is now and who he was back then and what his life is like now, there are all sorts of things going on that are not in the prose in Neil's story. The narrator is looking out the window. He talks about having a wife and children, and you see these children on the swing set. And when you go outside and see them, way in the distance, I put there was a church and a churchyard, a graveyard. And the very last panel of that scene is just a close-up of the face of the little girl on the swing, and now you see that cemetery much closer. So you have this visual combination of Death and the Maiden, this little girl, and the image of death. And that's a foreshadowing of something that happens later. Now, there's nowhere in the original story that states there's a girl on a swing with a graveyard in the background. So the artist is providing a sideways, a parallel narrative that is either commenting on, enriching, enlarging, maybe even commenting ironically on the text. You can do all sorts of things that way. You can have a person walking down the street, as I did towards the end of the story, where our narrator is walking away from a situation and thinking about love and death and such. And I had him in 3 panels, just sort of at a diagonal walking down the street. We're looking down at this guy going from a left to right angle down across the street. And at the last minute, I dropped the middle panel and put this little tin angel drop on its side, a symbol of death from a fight and a murder earlier in the story. Nowhere in the original prose is he thinking of a little tin, Christmas tree angel on its side, but it comments on on the text. And so those are the things that you put in that are your own, personal response to the story. Someone else adapting the same story, I doubt would have put the little tin angel. They might have found some other way to express, their thoughts about the story. But that's your personal take on it that you should be bringing, and it's a visual element that's not in the story, that comments on the story. And that's what I mean by it has to work, in this form. Actually, Neil Gaiman's Coraline, which I adapted as graphic novel, was also turned into an opera. I haven't heard anything about it, if it was successful or not, but it had to work, as a staged singing piece. So each form has its own dictates, and you have to make this form compatible in that form. And that's the challenge of doing any adaptation.
You've said in other interviews that you've given that your favorite part of making comics is the initial work of laying out and designing a story. Mm-hmm. Why does that appeal to you?
Well, it's I think the most original part. Like I was saying earlier, I think the one thing I have that is entirely original to myself. I mean, yes, I've grown up in comics and I know the grammar of storytelling, and especially early on I was influenced by Steranko and Krigstein and Eisner and all of that. But when I'm sitting there with that script or with the original prose in front of me and trying to figure out, I'm not referencing anyone else, no film directors, no other storytellers. My response is entirely original to that prose. Now, when I start drawing it, I might be like looking through all kinds of art books for costume ideas and sort of referencing my own material or taking photos of people acting out parts for reference. So there's a lot of just pulling in from all these other places when I'm actually making a picture. Yes, a lot of it I make up myself, especially in organic elements like clouds and fire and forests and waves and all of that. But still, I feel like I'm an amalgam of other artists. But when I'm doing the layouts, there's no one there but me and the piece. So that's fun. On the other hand, after spending 2.5 years doing layouts and script for American Gods, I've got a lot of pent-up drawing, and since January I've been doing nothing but some really complex single illustrations. So it's when you're doing the one, you're happy, but you're looking forward to doing the other at the same time.
So you're kind of taking us into your creative process a little bit here. Once you select a text that you want to adapt, what does your creative process entail? Can you walk me through what it involves from the beginning?
Yeah, it's fairly simple. I will take, I tear the book literally apart page by page. And I go over to the Xerox place and I'll put pages, they have to face, so pages 2 and 3 down on the copier. And I select the 11 by 17 paper and I make a copy of it. So I have 2 pages of the prose and all of these giant wide margins around so that I can do thumbnails and notes and write stuff out. And that's what I have is the book is this giant sheaf of papers that are 11 by 17, and I can work on them a chapter at a time. So I will just read it over and over till I get it into my head, almost like you're looking at it in 3D. And then I'll just start on doing simple things like underlining the dialogue so it pops out on the page. And then I start looking at that and thinking, if we have, space considerations, how do I cut this down? How do I reduce this conversation by 50% and still make it work? What are the highlights of this descriptive passage? Or if it's a descriptive passage, I can cross it out altogether because I'm going to draw it. The author is painting a picture in your head. You don't need those words usually. So there's that simple thing of, okay, I'll draw this. I don't have to worry about this bit of the prose. And then you're trying to stitch it all together again. What I've taken to doing in the last 10 years, I think, is instead of trying to design a page as I'm writing it, I'll do it almost like storyboards, tiny little half-inch squares just all along the bottom. Here's what I need to show, a series of actions, if there is a series of actions. Here's the hand reaching for the gun. Here's the person. Okay, they're going to respond. Are we going to show it from this angle or the point of view from the other person? I'll make those little decisions, try them out. and just have this whole long row of pictures. And then I will say, okay, I've got like 5 pages to do this scene. How many of these little boxes do I have? Are there too many? Can you put 2 of these into one? Will it move faster if you have it all in one panel? One way of advancing the action is if somebody says something, you have the person replying to them in the same panel. So you have that decision to make. If you're going to just show the person speaking, you give them their own panel with their word balloon, and then the other person speaking in a panel with their own word balloon. Why do you want to separate those? Maybe you want to slow down time. If you want to speed it up, you have them in the same panel. I try not to have too much dialogue in the same panel. I try to keep it fairly light. But with American Gods, I had some pretty, narratively or dialogue dense pages. But there's all these decisions, point of view. And what gets me started, at least, and like I say, it's these little pictographs of storyboards that at least get it out there. Now I can start to, like clay, start to fashion it, work with it, divide it up into pages. This is a good panel to start a page with, and this is a good page turner. This panel here at the end, I would really like to, end the page on this panel, but it's kind of dense if I want to do this all in one picture. So is there anything I can cut? How can I combine stuff to make it work? So it's just that, it's just thinking and fashioning until it slowly comes into focus. There's hardly a way to say this is how you do it. It's because every single page is different.
In February, you published your newest graphic novel, an adaptation of Lois Lowry's The Giver. And I want to take some time to talk about that because I mentioned to you, I think of all of your adaptations, it stands out as one of your most beautiful. How did that project come about?
It came about because they called me, an editor called or sent me an email, I think, and asked if I would be interested in doing Lois Lowry's The Giver. And I had never read it. I was decades past the target audience, basically middle school and high school, because the book came out in, I think, the early 90s. So I said, well, I'll read it. I'll take a look at it. And as soon as I read it, I said, oh, absolutely, I want to do this. I mean, what a great story. And the way it was told and the memory sequences and all of that. And I was also intrigued by the challenge of it because so much of it is sort of visual, non-visual. I mean, these memories that he transmits, those you can show. But then when she's talking about the transmission of a memory, say, from Jonas to Gabe, the baby, and he's taking this memory and giving it to him, how do you make that visual? Well, those were the kinds of challenges I liked. So ultimately, it was even though it was very dialogue heavy in single rooms, it was a very visual story, I think, to tell. And I think she told a very visual story because it's certainly about pictures and memories that are given. I also liked the play between, you had 3 separate visuals going on, the so-called real world and the colony without color. You had the world of all these memories, which was war and famine and love and sailboats and all sorts of things that you could do a real range of pictures. And then there was the real world or the outer world at the end where he leaves the commune and it all comes into glorious technicolor. So I was from the very beginning thinking of drawing the story in blue pencil and ink wash and ending it with, inked drawings in full color. So you had that contrast. It was real theatrical stroke, when you turn the page and the light comes up. And then the visual handling of the memory sequences gave a third distinct visual element to it. So I love those 3 things working together to tell the whole story.
You mentioned, as the story unfolds, Jonas, who's the story's protagonist, learns that he has this ability to see beyond or to see things as they really are, as opposed to seeing in the shades of gray that people in his community tend to see the world. And you mentioned that in adapting that into a visual form, you chose to use blue pencil. I think you also used lead pencil.
Yeah, right. It was a technique I sort of learned from Dan Adkins, in that he would draw things in blue pencil, sort of the sketchy stuff, and then he would finish it in pencil. So you had a nice, really clear, finished line. It was almost like inking with a pencil. And then he would ink that. And that's one of the things I learned. And when I started working on Killraven, I would draw it all in pencil, and then I would finish it in lead pencil, and then I would ink it until I finally realized I didn't need that blue pencil step. Just draw it in pencil and ink it. I was drawing it 3 times. So I then would learn how to ink and drop that first stage. But I had done some things where I had fairly tight blue pencils, and then I put pencil on top of it, and the blue pencil would show through. And it just made a really nice effect that you could take this that was not intended to be used this way and run with it. You know, you go in with more blue on top of the pencil, design it so that it is a finished drawing in blue and gray, which gives it sort of a silvery look that I always liked. So I did like my story, Isolation and Illusion, which is drawn in blue pencil and pencil. Some scenes in The Ring of the Nibelung that were flashbacks were all done that way and shot for color so that you see the blue. So that was a way of making it interesting, visually giving an extra something to it. So it looked like a world in which there was not color, rather than just, you know, doing an ink drawing and printing it in black and white, you know, which would kind of look like a comic book that just simply didn't have color, rather than the world these people inhabited didn't have color. So I thought it gave the sense that by adding color, a little bit of color, added to the effect of a world without color.
In an interview that I came across, you described Lowry's novel as one of the more terrifying stories that you've read.
Yes.
What do you find terrifying about it?
Well, the nature of the totalitarian society they are living in, the iron fist and the velvet glove. Everything purports to be lovely and nice, and everyone's needs are met, but it's a horror show for treating people as just basically widgets. You know, you're 12 years old, and here's what you're going to do for the rest of your life. You're assigned to these things. There's no individual freedom. That's an absolute, total loss of individual freedom. And that's terrifying. That's a horrible way to live. And the euphemistic way they treat murder and euthanasia and such, that one is being, what is the word they use? Released. You've been released from society, whether through old age or a mistake you've made or you're an underweight baby. All of those things are just that soft, mushy way of disguising horrors, really ethical horrors that are going on.
Is there a particular scene or a sequence in The Giver that was especially fun or enjoyable for you to work on?
Well, the one where Jonas, now that he is the receiver, is allowed to look at anything. That was also one of the horrible things, that everyone else at the age of 12 is given all these books of instructions for their lives, and he's given a slip of paper with a 10, I think it was 10 rules, and the last one was, you may lie, even though this society purports to be built on absolute truth and clarity. And he's told, as the most important new person there, that he can lie. But he's also then allowed to ask anyone any questions for any information, look at anything, go anywhere. And, his father is a nurturer. He's one of the ones that takes care of the newborn babies, and he's also responsible for releasing them when they're defective. And of course he thinks his dad is great and does this wonderful work. And the old man, the giver, says, well, maybe you'd like to see what he does. And he says, well, I know he's releasing one of the babies today, and he thinks that means it's going to be sent to another community, that the outside world. Well, he, camera surveillance, everything is under surveillance. He sees his father come into the medical receiving room, the laboratory, whatever, where they weigh these 2 babies, and the one is underweight, and he then takes the needle and sticks it in the baby's head until it convulses and dies, and he puts it in a box and throws it down the garbage chute. Bye-bye, he says. And Jonas is watching this, absolutely horrified at this. And I did not flinch from anything in that. I mean, I looked right at it, just as Lois Lowry had us looking right at it, except there's an added thing when you're looking at it visually and not just, in your mind. And I had that close up of the baby and the needle, and I thought, I wonder if they're going to even let this go. I mean, if I thought of anything I've done in this book that they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, that's just too horrible. But they did not, and they let it go, and he puts it in that box and pulls down the trash chute thing, and it goes into the black, and that went through. And so that was, you asked me my favorite scene. Well, I think that was the one I was really aware of what I was doing and wondering if it was going to go through, and in the layout, being very careful to show exactly what was happening.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because you said in the same interview I referenced earlier at the end of The Giver that you suspect that graphic novel may be the first one you've worked on that's going to elicit calls to remove it from bookshelves.
Yeah, well, I've just heard that on the list of banned books, the novel The Giver is right up there. So if the novel is asked to be removed, or I imagine the graphic novel possibly even more so, because people have the idea that graphic novels or comic books are exclusively for children. So they may be even more likely. But we'll see. I haven't heard anything yet.
Do you think that the fact that you're rendering that story in a visual format amplifies the discomfort that people are likely to feel over scenes like the one that you've described with Jonas's father and the infant?
Yes. That's a short answer to it. Yeah, I think they will, because you're like I said, if you're reading about it, it's one thing. But to look at it, which is what Jonas is forced to do, to look at what's happening, can be more discomforting.
When you worked on The Giver, you shared the illustrative work with two other artists, Galen Showman and Scott Hampton.
Yes.
And you worked with a separate colorist and a letterist. How do you go about negotiating projects that involve multiple creators like that? What does that process entail?
Well, simply calling someone up and saying, I'm doing this, and I could see you helping out on this aspect of it. Are you interested? There was one, I'll say quickly, the one thing a writer can do that can drive an artist crazy, they can describe anything. Here comes the 7th Battalion over the hill, and with 50 tanks and 30 airplanes, and you're supposed to draw all that. You want me to draw what? And now The Giver had bicycles. If you ever tried to draw a bicycle, it's a tremendously complicated piece of work. So when I was looking for someone else, I was doing the layouts and the script and the finishes, but I wanted someone to do penciling. Taking all these photos of the kid and the bicycles and all that. And this is something, I can work with someone. Once I've got that layout down, someone else could do that. I called up Kevin Nolan because he had done work on the Graveyard book. I did the script and layouts for the Graveyard book. Kevin did one of the stories, so I called him up. And we have sort of a similar drawing style. They mesh very well, so that would be a good combo. And I asked him if he was interested in what I was doing. It was The Giver, and he said, "Is that the one with the bicycles?" Yeah, they're not in there all the time. He passed. Luckily, Galen Showman, who's either been my assistant or a collaborator for some 20 years, lives practically in my backyard. And he'd also worked with me on the Graveyard book. And he was available. And so he went home, and he has a very precise method of working. So it's great to do, the so-called inks over his pencils, because it's all there. Sort of almost like Dan Adkins. Every line was crisp and right there. And when he does a bicycle, every nut and bolt is there. Although he did come up with a way of sort of like a shield that some bicycles have over the chain. So we didn't have to draw the chain. So he did like 130 some pages. All the community pages were his until Jonas leaves, and then I did the whole finished start to finish artwork for the last 2.5 chapters. And then for the memory sequence, I'd worked with Scott Hampton on the Graveyard book, and he was just great to work with. And he has a much more painterly style than either Galen or Kevin or I do. But that would kind of work for the memories. It set those scenes visually somewhat apart. The layout, the design of the page remained consistent with the rest of the book, but the visual look of it was just different. And that was those were the scenes where we used monocolor, because one of the questions I had was that, Jonah sees color for the first time when he sees the apple. And so that's easy for the writer to do. And then when he leaves the community, the full color comes up. But these memories, she talks about a red sled. I said, now, do we do those memories in full color? Because that will undercut the sort of theatrical stroke at the end where the full color comes in, sort of like Wizard of Oz in reverse. So that's when I came up with the idea, we'll just do a single monochrome, like in silent films, especially back in the day when they made them, would have different color filters. So a night scene would be blue, a scene in the desert would be yellow, a wild party would be red, another scene would be done in sepia tone. Even though it wasn't a color film, they had some color to give a certain emotional effect. So I settled on that. So we had monochrome color so that it had some color but didn't undercut the big reveal at the end. So anyway, a long-winded way of saying who do you call and how do you handle that. And as far as lettering, when I'm doing the script and layouts, I letter everything in and draw in the word balloons. I mean rough lettering, because that movement of the balloons and the dialogue is so much a part of the design of the page that I definitely want to do that and not leave that to chance. But once I've done that, the actual physical lettering is in the hands of, in this case, Rick Parker, who had just done the Graveyard book for me. And I love hand lettering, and it's not done very often anymore. But it's just the page feels naked without it. And like I say, it's a part of the design of the page. So I would mail pages off to him in Maine, and he would mail them back, and Galen would take them and blue pencil them, and then I would do the finished pencils on top of that with the ink wash.
Are there ever instances when you're sharing the illustrative work with Galen and Scott, are there ever instances where maybe there's, I don't want to say creative differences, but they say to you, we could do this more effectively if we were to?
No, there haven't. I'm thinking on The Giver, because I work so closely with Galen, and actually he and I were taking photos together, would have models over, and I'd already done the sort of stick figures and storyboarding on the full page. We knew what we needed with that. So it was pretty clear what we needed. I think only a panel of Scott's memory sequences was a prison escape, and that was kind of tricky to figure out because his pages weren't always full pages. Sometimes there were one or two panels on a page, so there was a lot of mailing stuff back and forth or sending digital files. It got kind of complicated. But anyway, for this prison escape, there were sort of tiny little figures, and I thought, no, we need this guy crawling through the mud close up, and I redrew that panel, and that's the only time I've ever done that, and I dropped that one in instead. Otherwise, it was, he followed the layouts, and everything was fine. There was no problems.
So what's next for you now that you have Giver behind you? Do you have new projects lined up, or are you taking time off?
Oh, no time off. I finished the American Gods a couple months ago, and the 27 issues of that, and Scott Hampton is working on the last, I think, about 2 issues right now. He's almost finished, a 3-year-long project. So this year, what I'm gearing up to do, we're going to do another crowdfunding the campaign for the final Oscar Wilde fairy tale book. We're going to publish this one ourselves, Wayne, Harold, and I, through a crowdfunding thing, and we're going to see if we can generate enough money to make it, sort of like a page rate as any other sort of professional project. And one of the things we've done for all of the crowdfunding things is that I do a series of commissions, and I would sort of announce, like, I will do these characters that I've worked on, and here are the prices for a black and white or a full color, and people, if they buy them, then that raises some money for the project. And this time, what I'm doing is I'm doing the commissions ahead of time, and a series of full color paintings and black and white drawings, and we'll put those up and see if people just sort of, decide to buy one of those. So since early January, I'm working on, I have 6 in the works, 4 complete, 5th almost complete, and the 6th halfway drawn, of 15-inch squares that will be full color pieces. Some of them relate to characters I've done before. Some of them are completely new pieces. So I'm taking about 3 months to do those, and a couple months to do some of my oversized song pieces that I've been working on for 20 years. And then I will do the Oscar Wilde book, which will take me up to the fall. And then there's a project with Dark Horse we're talking about, which I probably shouldn't say anything about yet until it becomes finalized, but another big adaptation.
Thank you so much, Craig, for making time to talk with me. I always learn so much from you. I wish you the best of luck with The Giver.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been fun talking to you, Sean.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this month's episode of The Storyteller's Thread. If you liked what you heard, please tell a friend about the show. In the meantime, I'll look forward to seeing you back here in April, when we'll continue to talk about the craft of storytelling and literature for children and young adults. Till then, happy reading.